There was a time when Lena's smile felt like home. Michael could still remember the way she used to look at him, not just with affection, but with a quiet certainty that their love was a safe place, a constant in a world that never stopped changing. He held on to that certainty like an anchor, believing that if they just stayed true to what they had, nothing could touch them. But slowly, that changed. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cruel. It was quiet. Subtle. Like the way fog rolls in over the water, one minute there's a clear view, the next everything is slightly blurred. Lena started talking differently, asking questions she hadn't asked before. "Do you ever feel like we're missing something?" she asked one evening as they sat on the back porch sipping wine. The summer air was warm, and the cicadas sang in the distance. Michael had looked at her, brow furrowed. "Missing something," he repeated. "We've built a life. A good one." Lena had smiled then, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I know. I wonder if this is what love is supposed to look like forever. Predictable. Comfortable. Maybe love isn't meant to stay still." Michael didn't know how to respond. Because for him, stillness wasn't stagnation, it was strength. Love, to him, wasn't supposed to be a thrill ride. It was a quiet promise. One that stood the test of time, of boredom, of restlessness. But for Lena, the comfort had started to feel like confinement. She was restless, seeking something he couldn't quite see. She started reading books about emotional reinvention and attending seminars that preached the beauty of chaos in relationships, of growth through discomfort. She started spending more time out, meeting new people, doing things that had never interested her before. Salsa nights. Creative retreats. Improv groups. She would come home buzzing with stories about the people she met, the new experiences she'd had, and every time she looked at Michael during those stories, there was a faint trace of guilt in her eyes. Michael watched her change like someone watching a distant storm roll across a horizon, beautiful in its intensity, terrifying in its implications. He tried to meet her where she was. He went to a few events with her. He listened. He tried to understand this new language she was speaking, this new version of love she seemed to crave. But every time he tried, it felt like trying to dance to a rhythm he couldn't hear. He loved her. He didn't want to hold her back. But more and more, he realized they were drifting, not because they didn't care, but because they were walking toward different definitions of what love meant. And Michael, grounded in his steadfast heart, began to understand something quietly devastating. Sometimes love changes not because it fails, but because it evolves into something one person no longer recognizes. And sometimes, the most loving thing you can do, is let go. Michael began to notice the space between them not in words, but in pauses. The way Lena answered questions a beat too late, her mind clearly elsewhere. The way her laughter still came, but only in rooms he wasn't in. Their shared silences, once easy and comforting, now felt strained, like both were waiting for the other to speak and say something that would bring them back. She had started sleeping later on weekends, often staying out with friends or attending events that he wasn't invited to. Michael didn't need to be in every part of her world, he wasn't clingy, never had been, but what unsettled him was how little of her world she now shared. Conversations turned into summaries, as though Lena were offering him a distant, sanitized version of her life rather than inviting him into it. He tried to bridge the gap, to find ways back to the closeness they once took for granted. He suggested a weekend getaway, just the two of them, somewhere quiet, like they used to do. Lena smiled and said it sounded nice, but she never brought it up again. A month passed. Then two. The trip remained unbooked. One evening, Michael found himself sitting alone on the edge of their bed, scrolling through photos on his phone. Their anniversary dinner 2 years ago, Lena leaning against his shoulder, both of them glowing with warmth and familiarity. A summer camping trip, her messy hair tied up, hands outstretched toward a lake. Those moments felt close and impossibly far all at once. He hadn't realized that even while standing next to her, he had already begun losing her. It wasn't betrayal. It wasn't some dramatic fallout. It was something quieter. More insidious. She was searching for something new, something undefined, and that search didn't include him. Lena had begun expressing new philosophies about love. Maybe love isn't just about loyalty or comfort, she'd said one night, swirling her wine in slow circles. Maybe it's about self-expansion. About not limiting yourself for someone else. Her voice wasn't accusatory, but there was a challenge buried inside her words, a gentle confrontation against everything Michael believed. He understood what she was saying. He wasn't oblivious to the human need for growth. But Michael's view of love had always been about enduring growth together, not wandering off to grow separately in hopes that one day you might return to each other more complete. To him, love wasn't a search for newness, it was the daily commitment to keep choosing the same person, even as the world around you shifted. But Lena no longer wanted to be chosen in the same way. She wanted to be discovered anew, over and over, even if that meant becoming someone Michael didn't recognize anymore. The moment that sealed it came quietly. They were sitting in the kitchen one morning, sunlight filtering through the windows, warming the room in golden light. Michael was flipping through a newspaper while Lena tapped away at her phone. No argument, no drama. Just another ordinary morning. And then she said, without looking up, "I think I need to be alone for a while." Michael didn't ask what that meant, he already knew. It wasn't about needing space for a day or two. It was the beginning of a separation not just in geography, but in soul. He set the paper down, met her gaze, and nodded. "I figured," he said softly. "I'm not unhappy," Lena added quickly, as though trying to soften the blow. "I just feel like there's more I need to explore. About myself. About what love could mean. And I don't want to lie to you. I don't want to pretend I'm fully here when part of me is already somewhere else." Michael didn't beg. He didn't guilt her. He simply listened. It hurt, yes, but the kind of hurt that came with clarity, not confusion. That night, he lay awake beside her, knowing it was one of the last nights they'd share a bed. She turned away from him as she fell asleep, and in that gesture was 1,000 unspoken truths. Loving Lena meant accepting that her journey no longer walked parallel to his. He couldn't force alignment where it no longer existed. He couldn't hold her still when her spirit longed to run. And so, Michael began preparing himself, not for battle, not for a dramatic goodbye, but for the slow, deliberate act of letting go with grace. Because sometimes, the truest form of love isn't about holding tighter. It's about opening your hand, and allowing someone to find whatever they're looking for, even if it's not you. It was never one moment that made Michael decide to let her go. It was a collection of them, quiet, lingering, unmistakable. The kind of moments that slowly erode the illusion that love alone can hold two people together. There was the day she didn't come home until well after midnight, texting only once to say she was just out thinking. There was the morning he made her favorite breakfast, blueberry pancakes and fresh coffee, only for her to push her plate away after one bite, apologizing, distracted, already dressed to go somewhere she didn't bother explaining. And then there were the nights she crawled into bed after he was asleep, curling her body to the edge of the mattress as though proximity might betray her emotional distance. He began to feel like a guest in his own home, like someone who had overstayed his welcome in a life that used to be his. She hadn't said the words "I don't love you" anymore, but it was in the way she no longer lingered in conversations, the way her eyes drifted when he spoke, the way she started saying "I" more often than "we." Her language had changed, and Michael understood that language, even unspoken, always told the truth. It would have been easier, perhaps, if she had done something obvious, something that gave him an excuse to be angry, to cast her as the villain in a story of betrayal. But Lena wasn't cruel. She wasn't reckless. She was just changing in a direction that no longer included him. And that was its own kind of heartbreak, harder to fight, harder to hate. Michael had always believed love was about weathering storms together. He had believed in riding out the hard seasons, believing spring would come again. But this This wasn't a storm. It was a divergence. Lena wasn't waiting to be rescued. She wasn't even asking him to understand. She had already begun walking a path that didn't make room for him. So one evening, when the air between them was filled with a silence that had stopped being peaceful and started feeling like goodbye, Michael quietly asked, "Do you still want to be here?" Lena didn't answer immediately. Her shoulders stiffened, and she stared out the window like she could find the answer in the streetlights. When she turned back to him, her eyes were glassy but clear. "I don't know how to be who I'm becoming and still be who I was with you." That was when he knew. Not because she didn't love him, he suspected some part of her still did, but because she needed something he could no longer give without breaking the core of who he was. She needed uncertainty, exploration, spontaneity. And Michael? Michael needed stability, devotion, and the quiet rhythms of a love that deepened over time rather than reinvented itself. They sat for a long time without speaking. Lena didn't ask him to fight for her. She didn't beg him to understand. And Michael didn't demand answers or ultimatums. They both knew those would only delay the inevitable. This wasn't about blame. It was about recognition, two people finally acknowledging that their definitions of love had outgrown their shared reality. The next morning, Michael brewed coffee like he always did. He made 2 cups out of habit, placing hers on the kitchen counter. When she walked in, he didn't speak. He just slid the cup toward her, then sat across from her at the table. "I think you should go," he said, his voice calm, but resolute. "Not because I'm angry. Not because I want you to suffer. But because you need to know what it is you're chasing. And I don't want to be the reason you don't find it." Lena's eyes brimmed with tears, but she didn't argue. She nodded slowly, swallowing a lump in her throat. "Are you sure?" Michael exhaled. "I'm sure of what I believe love is. And I'm sure that trying to change that just to keep you here would only make me resent you. And that's the last thing I want." It was the hardest thing he'd ever done, choosing peace over possession. Choosing to let her go, not because he didn't love her, but because he loved her enough to want her to be true to herself, even if that truth led her away from him. They didn't pack her bags in a fury. There were no slammed doors, no raised voices. Just quiet movements. Careful folding. Soft goodbyes. He helped her carry her suitcase to the car. When she turned to hug him, it was full-bodied and trembling. For a moment, it felt like neither wanted to let go. But he stepped back first, offering a final, gentle smile. "Go find whatever it is you need to find," he said. "And know that I'll be okay." And he meant it. Even through the ache, he meant it. Because real love, Michael had come to believe, isn't about clinging to someone as they slip away. It's about giving them the freedom to leave, and having the strength to stay behind. Lena left on a Monday morning that smelled like rain. The sky hung low, overcast, as if it, too, felt the weight of her decision. She packed the last of her things into the trunk of her car with slow, deliberate movements. As she pulled out of the driveway, she didn't look back, not because she wasn't grieving, but because she didn't know if she could keep going if she did. The first few days were exhilarating in their own strange way. She checked into a short-term rental downtown, with wide windows and minimal furniture, a blank slate, both literally and figuratively. It felt like the first breath after holding her lungs tight for too long. For the first time in years, no one expected her to show up a certain way. She didn't have to explain her thoughts or hide her restlessness. She could just be. She filled her days with motion. Art galleries. Long walks through unfamiliar neighborhoods. Coffee shops with mismatched furniture where no one knew her name. She took classes in things she'd never tried before, ceramics, improv, even aerial yoga. She read books that challenged her worldview and spent hours in bookstores just thumbing through titles she never thought to read while she was with Michael. Each new experience was a small rebellion against the life she'd left behind. At night, she sat with a glass of wine by the window, the city humming beneath her. There was a freedom in solitude, a kind of independence that felt fresh and thrilling. But in that same quiet, there was also the slow return of echoes, Michael's voice telling her some joke from the paper, the sound of their shared laughter over a movie they'd seen a dozen times, the memory of how he'd always reached for her hand in his sleep. Still, she pressed on. She dated, hesitantly at first. There was a brief affair with a painter who lived in a converted warehouse. He was wild and free-spirited and everything Lena thought she wanted in this new chapter. They drank too much, talked until sunrise, made love in the chaos of mismatched sheets and open paint cans. But the excitement was shallow. There was no real ground beneath it. The conversations never reached the depth of what she had shared with Michael, and the laughter lacked the history that made it feel truly intimate. She told herself it was okay. She was learning. Exploring. Becoming. But eventually, the shine of discovery began to dull. The nights out started feeling repetitive, and the faces she met blurred together. Everyone she encountered was seeking something: thrill, escape, validation, but very few were seeking the kind of connection that went beyond the surface. Lena found herself yearning not for adventure, but for quiet companionship. For someone who had already seen her messy and unguarded and had chosen to stay. She began to think more and more about Michael. Not with regret, not at first, but with a kind of soft nostalgia. The way he always remembered to warm her mug before pouring coffee. How he instinctively knew when she needed space and when she needed arms around her. The steadiness he brought to every storm she ever felt brewing inside her. She had left in search of something deeper, but more and more, it seemed like depth was exactly what she had walked away from. She didn't resent the journey she was on. She had grown. She had discovered new pieces of herself: boldness, creativity, emotional independence. But with that growth came a painful truth: in her hunger for newness, she had perhaps underestimated the value of something old, something tested and real. Late one evening, she stood on the rooftop of her building, the city spread beneath her like a map of choices. The wind tugged at her coat as she stared out, wondering if Michael was looking at the same moon. She thought about calling him, about hearing his voice and telling him what she had discovered, not just about life, but about herself. But she didn't. She didn't because she wasn't sure she had the right. Michael had given her the freedom to leave, and he hadn't asked her to return. He had loved her enough to let go, and she respected him too much to interrupt whatever peace he may have found in her absence. And so, she stood in the quiet, hands in her pockets, the night cool and still. In her heart, she knew she had chased something beautiful, the dream of reinvention, of rediscovery. But perhaps the most profound discovery wasn't found in new cities or new lovers or nights that blurred into morning. Perhaps the real revelation was this: that love, real love, doesn't always have to be exciting to be extraordinary. Sometimes, it's quiet. Sometimes, it's stable. Sometimes, it's just a warm mug and a familiar hand reaching out in the dark. And maybe, just maybe, that had been enough all along. The days after Lena left were quiet, but not empty. For Michael, life moved forward in the way that life often does, steadily, without fanfare. He continued his routines not out of denial, but because they gave him something to hold on to, something solid in the midst of emotional change. Mornings began with coffee on the porch, the same chair, the same view of the quiet street. At night, he still cooked for two for a while, until it became clear that the second plate was only a habit, not a hope. There was no dramatic breakdown. No spiraling grief. Michael grieved in the way that steady people do, silently, with dignity. He missed her, certainly. There were moments, often small and unremarkable, that hit unexpectedly. Reaching for a blanket she used to curl up under. Hearing a song on the radio that she once sang along to, off-key but smiling. Finding one of her scarves tucked in the back of a closet, still faintly scented with the perfume she wore on weekends. He let himself feel those moments. He didn't push them away. But he also didn't let them consume him. He understood something many people never do: that heartbreak doesn't always come with chaos. Sometimes, it arrives gently, and you have to carry it with grace. Friends offered advice. Some told him to get back out there, as if new love was a cure for lost love. Others suggested he try therapy, or take a vacation, or find a hobby that didn't remind him of her. Michael nodded politely but knew that what he needed was not distraction. He needed time to simply be, with himself, with his thoughts, with the stillness she had left behind. Months passed. Seasons turned. His life settled into a new rhythm. Not better or worse, just different. He no longer checked his phone expecting a message from her. He stopped wondering whether she would return. Not because he had stopped caring, but because he had accepted the truth. Lena had needed something else, and he had given her the gift of space to find it. Sometimes he would wonder, not out of longing, but curiosity, what her life looked like now. He imagined her walking through crowded streets, laughing with strangers, trying new things, possibly even falling in love again. He hoped she was happy. He truly did. Because his love for her hadn't turned to bitterness. It had simply transformed into a quieter kind of affection, the kind that doesn't need reciprocation to exist. Then one afternoon, months after the last time they spoke, he received a letter. It wasn't dramatic, handwritten on simple stationery, postmarked from the city where she had been living. Lena's voice came through in every word. She didn't ask to come back. She didn't confess regret. Instead, she wrote with honesty and reflection. She told him that she had found many of the things she had gone looking for: excitement, newness, independence, but with each experience, she had begun to realize that none of it had filled the particular space he once occupied. She admitted she still didn't have all the answers. That maybe she never would. But what she knew now, with more clarity than ever, was that the kind of love they shared had been rare, not flashy or loud, but deeply rooted, unwavering. Michael read the letter slowly, once, then again. He smiled to himself, not a smile of triumph or sadness, but one of quiet understanding. He didn't write back. Not because he was angry. Not because he didn't care. But because there are some goodbyes that don't require a response, only a kind of acceptance that allows both people to keep moving. Michael folded the letter, placed it in a drawer with a few other mementos he'd quietly kept, and went back to his porch as the evening light stretched across the pavement. Life had changed, yes. But he was still here. Still whole. Still believing in the kind of love that doesn't need to be dramatic to be real. And as the wind stirred the trees and shadows danced along the sidewalk, he felt no emptiness. Only peace.